There's a map hanging in natural history museums around the world. A map of Africa with a red dot somewhere in East Africa, maybe Ethiopia, maybe Kenya, labeled as the birthplace of humanity. Arrows sweep outward from that dot, showing how our ancestors spread across the globe. Europe by 60,000 years ago, Asia around the same time, Australia by 50,000, the Americas by 15,000. It's clean, it's simple, and according to some of the world's leading scientists, it's increasingly looking like fiction. For decades, this map represented our species' origin story, a story that billions of people learned in school, a story that shaped how we think about race, evolution, and what it means to be human, a story that, as it turns out, might be fundamentally wrong. Here's the version you probably know. About 200,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, probably near the Great Rift Valley in what we now call Ethiopia or Kenya, something remarkable happened. A population of archaic humans, our ancestors, underwent a transformation. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans. These early humans, the story goes, lived in Africa for over 100,000 years. They developed better tools, created the first art, learned to think symbolically. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Maybe it was a genetic mutation that gave them language. Maybe it was environmental pressure from climate change. Whatever the trigger, a small group of these humans left Africa, crossed into the Middle East, and began spreading across the globe. They walked into Europe and encountered the Neanderthals, those stocky, cold-adapted humans who'd been there for hundreds of thousands of years. They pushed into Asia and met other archaic human populations. And everywhere they went, according to the classic story, they replaced these other humans. Not through violence necessarily, but through being smarter, more adaptable, better at surviving. Within a few tens of thousands of years, every other type of human on Earth was extinct. Only Homo sapiens remained. This narrative, called the Out of Africa theory, or the recent African origin model, became the dominant explanation for human origins in the late 20th century. And for good reason, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Consider the fossils. The oldest, clearly modern human skulls, dating back about 200,000 years, were found in Ethiopia. At Omo Kibish, paleontologists discovered remains that looked fundamentally like us. At Herto, they found a skull dated to 160,000 years ago that could walk down a modern street without attracting much attention, at least from the neck up. East Africa, it seemed, was the cradle of humanity, the place where we became we. Then there was the genetic evidence, and this is where the story got really compelling. In the 1980s, researchers started analyzing mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the mother's line. They compared sequences from people all over the world, from every continent, every population group, every human lineage they could find. The results were stunning. All of that mitochondrial DNA, from every human alive, traced back to a common ancestor, a woman who lived in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media called her mitochondrial Eve, though that's misleading since she wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She was just the only one whose mitochondrial lineage survived to the present day. But here's what made the genetic evidence so powerful. When researchers looked at genetic diversity, the variety of different gene variants in populations, they found a clear pattern. African populations had the most genetic diversity. European populations had less. And Native American populations, the people who'd migrated furthest from Africa, had the least genetic diversity of all. This fit perfectly with what geneticists call a serial founder effect. Imagine a small group leaving Africa. They carry only a subset of Africa's total genetic variation. Then a small group splits off from them and heads to Europe, carrying an even smaller subset. Another group splits off and goes to East Asia. Then a smaller group crosses to the Americas. Each time, you lose a bit more genetic diversity. Like making copies of copies of copies, each generation becomes slightly less varied than the one before. The pattern was exactly what you'd expect if all humans originated in one place, Africa, and spread outward from there in a series of migrations. It was elegant, it was simple, and it seemed to explain everything. The archaeological evidence supported this too. The earliest examples of symbolic behavior, the earliest art, the earliest complex tool technologies, they all appeared first in Africa. Shell beads from Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to 75,000 years ago. Engraved ochre at Blombos, and nearby sites going back 100,000 years or more. These were signs of modern human cognition, the ability to think symbolically. When similar artifacts showed up in Europe and Asia, they appeared much later. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux in France, only about 17,000 years old. The complex stone tools called blade technologies, they appeared in Africa tens of thousands of years before showing up in Europe. Everything pointed to Africa as the source, the origin point for modern human behavior and biology. So, the story made sense. It fit the evidence. It had explanatory power. And for decades, it was what we taught in schools, what appeared in textbooks, what shaped our understanding of who we are and where we came from. East Africa was our Eden. The Rift Valley was our birthplace. The out-of-Africa migration, around 70,000 years ago, was the event that set the stage for everything that came after. For agriculture, civilization, the modern world, there was just one problem. The more we learned, the more this simple, elegant story started falling apart. New fossils kept showing up in the wrong places. Genetic studies revealed patterns that didn't quite fit. Archaeological discoveries pushed dates back further and further, until the timeline that seemed so solid started looking more like Swiss cheese, full of holes we couldn't explain. And those holes, those gaps in the story, they weren't small. Some scientists started asking uncomfortable questions. If humans evolved in East Africa, why were the oldest symbolic artifacts showing up in South Africa, thousands of miles away? If the out-of-Africa migration happened 70,000 years ago, why was there evidence of modern humans in the Middle East more than 100,000 years ago? If we completely replaced other human species without interbreeding, why did genetic studies keep finding Neanderthal DNA in modern human genomes? The classic story had answers for these questions, or at least it tried to. Maybe there were failed earlier migrations that died out. Maybe some of those archaeological sites were misdated. Maybe a tiny bit of interbreeding occurred, but it wasn't significant. But with each new discovery, the explanations became more complicated, the story less elegant, the certainty more elusive. And then came 2017, the year everything changed. The year a team of researchers published findings from a cave in Morocco that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about human origins. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand why that discovery was so shocking, you need to understand just how deeply the out-of-Africa story was embedded in our scientific worldview. It wasn't just a theory. It was the theory. The framework that organized all of human evolutionary biology. The narrative that made sense of our past. Think about what it meant. It said that all modern humans, every person alive today, descended from a relatively small population that lived in one region of one continent. It meant that all human diversity, all the physical and genetic variation we see across populations worldwide, emerged in just the last 100,000 years or so. It meant that we were, in evolutionary terms, an incredibly young and genetically homogeneous species, more closely related to each other than different populations of chimpanzees living a few hundred miles apart. This had profound implications beyond just academic anthropology. It shaped how we thought about race, about human difference, about our relationship to other human species like the Neanderthals. If the out-of-Africa story was correct, then racial categories were essentially meaningless from a biological standpoint. We were all Africans, just some of us had been living elsewhere for a few dozen millennia. It also meant that something special happened in Africa. Some combination of environmental pressure, genetic mutation, cultural innovation, or pure chance that created Homo sapiens. That made us different from every other human species that had come before. That gave us the cognitive and behavioral traits that would eventually allow us to dominate the planet. Scientists spent careers trying to figure out what that special something was. Was it language? Was it a reorganization of the brain that allowed for abstract thinking? Was it social complexity? The ability to cooperate in larger groups and maintain more complex relationships? Meanwhile, paleoanthropologists kept digging. In Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in caves and river valleys and ancient lake beds, looking for more fossils, more artifacts, more pieces of the puzzle. And they found them. Boy, did they find them. But what they found didn't always fit the story. Sometimes it contradicted it outright. By the early 2000s, cracks were appearing in the Out of Africa narrative. Small ones at first, easily explained away or incorporated into revised versions of the theory. But the cracks kept growing, and beneath them, a different picture was starting to emerge. A picture far more complex, far messier, and far more interesting than the textbook version most of us learned. This is the story of how one of science's most celebrated theories is being dismantled and rebuilt. How fossil discoveries, genetic breakthroughs, and archaeological revelations are forcing us to completely rethink where we came from. It's a story about the limits of scientific knowledge, about how much we still don't know, despite all our technological advances and sophisticated methods. But more than that, it's a story about us, about the mystery of human origins, about the question that has haunted our species since we first developed the capacity to wonder about such things. Where did we come from? How did we become human? And when we finally arrived, when Homo sapiens first walked the earth, where exactly did that happen? The answer, it turns out, is far stranger than anyone imagined, and it might force us to abandon the idea of a single human birthplace altogether. If you're listening to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what this is for. Maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are right now. Tokyo at 3 a.m. London at bedtime. Someone in Alaska watching the Northern Lights? I love seeing where everyone's listening from. All of us, scattered across this planet, our ancestors somehow managed to populate, wondering together about the deep mystery of how they did it. Because here's the thing that keeps paleoanthropologists awake at night. Every answer we find generates 10 new questions. Every fossil we discover rewrites a chapter of the story. Every genetic study reveals patterns we can't quite explain. And the more sophisticated our methods become, the more we realize how much we're still guessing. The Out of Africa theory isn't wrong, exactly. But it's not right either. The truth is more complicated, more nuanced, and in many ways more fascinating than the story we've been telling for the past 50 years. So let's dive into that complexity. Let's explore the discoveries that are forcing science to reckon with a human origin story that refuses to fit into neat categories. Let's follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts what we thought we knew, even when it challenges fundamental assumptions about our species and our past, starting with a cave in Morocco, a handful of bones, and a date that should have been impossible. The cave at Jebel Irhoud sits on a barren hillside about 100 kilometers west of Marrakesh, Morocco. It's not particularly impressive from the outside, just another hole in the limestone, the kind you'd walk past without a second glance. But inside that unremarkable cave lies evidence that would eventually blow apart everything we thought we knew about when and where our species began. The story actually starts in 1961, though nobody realized its significance at the time. A mining company was extracting barite, a mineral used in drilling operations, when workers stumbled across something unexpected. A human skull, embedded in the cave wall. They pulled it out, handed it to an engineer as a curiosity, and kept working. What followed was decades of confusion. The skull looked strange. It had features that seemed modern, a relatively flat face, small brow ridges, but it also had archaic characteristics, an elongated brain case that looked nothing like modern human skulls. Scientists couldn't figure out what they were looking at. Was it an early Homo sapiens? Was it a Neanderthal that somehow ended up in North Africa? Was it something else entirely? The dating didn't help. Initial estimates placed the skull at around 40,000 years old. That would make it a late arrival, possibly a modern human who had migrated to Morocco from elsewhere. Nothing particularly exciting, just another data point in a story that was already well understood, or so everyone thought. But some researchers couldn't let it go. The skull bothered them. It didn't quite fit anywhere in the human family tree. And the archaeological site where it was found, now collapsed and buried under tons of mining debris, contained layers of sediment that might hold answers. Enter Jean-Jacques Houblin, a French paleoanthropologist who had started his career studying that very jaw from Jebel Irhoud back in 1981. When he moved to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, he convinced his colleagues to fund a new excavation. They would reopen the site, find the intact sediment layers that remained, and finally date these mysterious fossils properly. The excavation began in 2004. It was painstaking work. The team had to carefully remove the mining debris, identify the original cave layers, and piece together the stratigraphy that would allow them to understand when these humans had lived and died. They weren't just looking for dates, they were looking for context, stone tools, animal bones, evidence of fires, anything that could tell them who these people were and how they lived. And they hit the jackpot. Not only did they find more fossils, including partial skulls, jaws, teeth, and limb bones from at least 5 individuals, they found them in a layer that also contained sophisticated stone tools and burnt flint from ancient hearths. Because burnt flint can be dated using a technique called thermoluminescence, which measures how long ago the flint was last heated. The team spent a year measuring the natural radioactivity of the sediment around the burnt flint. They analysed 14 separate samples to make sure their results were consistent, and when the dates came back, the researchers couldn't believe what they were seeing. 315,000 years old, give or take 34,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. These fossils, these humans with their modern-looking faces and archaic brain cases, were more than 300,000 years old. That pushed the origin of Homo sapiens back by over 100,000 years. It was like discovering that written language existed 5,000 years before we thought, or that the pyramids were built in the Stone Age. It fundamentally changed the timeline. But the age wasn't even the most shocking part. The location was Morocco, North Africa, thousands of miles from the supposed cradle of humanity in East Africa. These weren't humans who had migrated from the Rift Valley. These were humans who had been living in North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Living, hunting, making sophisticated tools, controlling fire, doing all the things that make us human. When the findings were published in Nature in June of 2017, the scientific community erupted. Some researchers were thrilled, vindicated in their suspicions that human origins were more complex than the textbook version. Others were skeptical, questioning whether these fossils really represented Homo sapiens, or were instead some kind of intermediate species. The debate centered on what makes a human anatomically modern. The Jebel Irhoud skulls had faces that looked remarkably like ours. Delicate cheekbones, a retracted face without the massive protruding jaw of more archaic species, teeth that fall within the range of modern human variation. If you just looked at the face, you'd say these were our species. But the brain cases told a different story. They were long and low, not the rounded globular shape that characterizes modern human skulls. This matters because brain shape correlates with brain organization. The elongated brain case of archaic humans suggests their brains were organized differently than ours, with different regions emphasized, possibly different cognitive capabilities. Houblin and his team argued that this mosaic of features, modern face with archaic brain case, represented the earliest stage of Homo sapiens evolution. They were looking at humans in transition, a population that had evolved the facial features we recognize as modern, but hadn't yet developed the brain shape that would come later. This created a profound question. If modern human features evolved in stages, with different traits appearing at different times, when exactly did Homo sapiens begin? Is it when the first modern feature appears? Is it when the brain reaches its modern organization? Is there even such a thing as a clear dividing line between archaic humans and modern ones? The Jebel Irhoud discovery suggested that maybe there isn't. Maybe human evolution wasn't a single moment of transformation, a clear before and after, but a gradual accumulation of modern traits across hundreds of thousands of years. But here's where things get really interesting. If the Jebel Irhoud humans represent early Homo sapiens, living in Morocco 315,000 years ago, they weren't alone. Other fossils from around the same time period have been found scattered across Africa, in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, each with their own mix of archaic and modern features. each showing that something was happening across the entire African continent. The team didn't propose that Morocco was the birthplace of humanity. That would just be replacing one simple story with another. Instead, they suggested something far more radical: that Homo sapiens didn't evolve in a single location at all, that our species emerged across the entire African continent, in multiple populations that were separated by geography but connected by occasional gene flow. They called it the Pan-African origin of Homo sapiens, and it completely upends the classic out-of-Africa narrative. Think about what this means. Instead of a small population in East Africa transforming into modern humans and then spreading, you have multiple populations across Africa, from Morocco to South Africa to Ethiopia, all evolving modern features, somewhat independently, but also interacting, mixing genes, sharing innovations. Some populations develop modern faces first, others develop modern brains first, others develop sophisticated tools or symbolic behaviors first. But over hundreds of thousands of years, these innovations spread and mix until eventually you have populations across Africa that all look and behave like anatomically modern humans. This explains some of the puzzles that the classic theory struggled with: why the earliest symbolic art shows up in South Africa, while the oldest clearly modern skulls come from East Africa and now North Africa. Why genetic diversity is highest in Africa overall, but doesn't point to a single region as the unambiguous source. Why modern human features seem to appear gradually rather than all at once. It also explains why the Jebel Irhoud humans had that strange mix of features. They weren't a failed experiment. They weren't a dead end. They were part of the process. One population among many that were all contributing to the emergence of our species across a continental scale. The stone tools found with the Jebel Irhoud fossils support this interpretation. They belong to the Middle Stone Age, a technological tradition characterized by sophisticated flaking techniques that produced sharp points and blades. This technology appears in Africa around 300,000 years ago and persists for hundreds of thousands of years. It shows up at sites across the continent, from North Africa to South Africa, suggesting widespread cultural connections between populations. Who made these tools? Until Jebel Irhoud, we weren't sure. Some researchers thought archaic humans like Homo heidelbergensis had invented Middle Stone Age technology. Others suspected it was early Homo sapiens but couldn't prove it. The Jebel Irhoud discovery provided direct evidence. These early humans, with their transitional anatomy, were making sophisticated stone tools. They were controlling fire, hunting large game, living in organized groups. They were, in many ways, already human, just not fully modern yet. The implications extend beyond just rewriting the origin date and location for our species. They change how we think about evolution itself. The classic model of human evolution imagines discrete species with clear boundaries. You're either Homo erectus, or Homo heidelbergensis, or Homo sapiens. You evolve in one place, then spread to others, replacing whatever was there before. The Jebel Irhoud picture is messier. It suggests that evolution can happen across large geographic areas with multiple interacting populations, that modern traits can evolve independently in different groups and then spread through gene flow, that the boundary between one species and another might be fuzzy, with transitional populations showing mixed features for hundreds of thousands of years. This isn't unprecedented. We know that Neanderthals evolved from earlier European populations over a long period, with different modern Neanderthal traits appearing at different times in different places. We know that other species show this kind of geographic variation and gradual evolution. But we'd thought humans were different, that we had a clearer origin story. The Jebel Irhoud fossils say otherwise. They say our story is just as complicated and messy as every other species on Earth. That we didn't emerge fully formed from a single Garden of Eden. That our origins are written across an entire continent, in dozens of sites, in hundreds of fossils we've found, and thousands we haven't. And here's the thing that makes this discovery so frustrating for researchers. The Jebel Irhoud cave, the actual site where these fossils were found, has been largely destroyed by mining operations. The layers that might have contained more fossils, more tools, more evidence of how these people lived, they're gone, blown apart, hauled away, processed for their mineral content. We're lucky we got what we did. That skull found in 1961 carefully preserved by an engineer who recognized its importance. The new excavations that found intact layers before they too were destroyed. The burnt flint that allowed for precise dating. Any one of these lucky breaks fails to happen. And we might never have known about these 300,000-year-old humans in Morocco. How many other sites have been destroyed before we could study them? How many fossils have eroded away, or been buried under cities or lost to geological processes? The fossil record is frustratingly incomplete, and every major discovery reminds us how much we're missing. But what we have is enough to know that the simple story is wrong. Humans didn't evolve in one place at one time and then spread. The process was more complex, more distributed, more dynamic than that. And if Jebel Uhud forced us to rethink when and where, the genetic studies that followed would force us to rethink how many different populations were involved in creating Homo sapiens, because the DNA evidence was about to get even stranger. For years, geneticists thought they had human origins figured out. The DNA told a clear story. All modern humans descended from a small African population that lived around 200,000 years ago. This population expanded, eventually sending groups out of Africa to populate the world. Simple, elegant, supported by mountains of genetic data. Then researchers started looking closer, and the story began to unravel. The first hint of trouble came from studies of African genetic diversity. Yes, African populations had the most genetic variation. That part was true, but the distribution of that variation didn't quite match what you'd expect from a single source population. Instead of diversity radiating outward from one region, it seemed to be structured geographically. Southern African populations had certain genetic signatures. East African populations had others. West and Central African populations had still others. This pattern suggested something the simple model didn't predict: that African populations had been separated from each other for a very long time, long enough to develop distinct genetic characteristics, long enough that they couldn't have all descended from a single small group just 200,000 years ago. In 2023, a groundbreaking study published in Nature took this observation and ran with it. Researchers analyzed whole genome sequences from populations across Africa and around the world, looking for the genetic signatures of ancient population structure. What they found was remarkable. The data suggested that the ancestral population that gave rise to all modern humans wasn't a single unified group. It was what geneticists call a weakly structured stem. Essentially, a collection of populations spread across Africa that were partially isolated from each other but also exchanging genes occasionally. These populations diverged from each other as early as 350,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. Let me break down what this means. Imagine Africa 350,000 years ago. You have human populations living in different regions. Maybe one group in the forests of Central Africa, another in the grasslands of East Africa, a third along the southern coast, a fourth in North Africa. These groups are separated by distance, by geography, by ecological barriers. They develop somewhat independently, accumulating their own unique genetic variations. But they're not completely isolated. Every few generations, maybe there's contact between neighboring groups. The populations remain distinct but also connected, like islands in an archipelago with occasional boats traveling between them. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this structure persists. Some populations contribute more to the modern human gene pool. Others contribute less. Some go extinct entirely. Some split into subpopulations. The connectivity between groups changes over time as climate shifts, as barriers appear and disappear, as populations expand and contract. Then, sometime between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, these populations begin mixing more thoroughly. The barriers break down, gene flow increases, the distinct populations start blending together. And from this mixing, from this continental-scale melting pot, emerges something new, anatomically modern, Homo sapiens, with the full suite of modern features. This is radically different from the traditional story. Instead of modern humans evolving in one place and spreading, they're evolving everywhere in Africa simultaneously. Different populations are contributing different pieces. The modern human genome isn't descended from one ancestral population. It's a mosaic, assembled from multiple source populations across the continent. The genetic evidence for this is surprisingly robust. When researchers look at different regions of the human genome, they find different patterns of ancestry. Some genetic regions trace back to East Africa, others to Southern Africa, still others to West or Central Africa. It's as if different parts of your genome had different birthplaces. This makes sense under the structured model. If your ancestors came from multiple populations that mixed together, different chunks of your DNA would retain signatures of those different sources. Some chromosomes might carry more East African ancestry, others more Southern African. The timeline fits too. The genetic divergence between African populations, around 350,000 years ago, matches almost perfectly with the age of the Jebel Irhoud fossils. This probably isn't coincidence. What we're seeing in the genes is the same process we're seeing in the fossils. Multiple populations across Africa developing modern human features semi-independently. But here's where it gets really interesting. The study also found evidence for something called ghost populations. These are populations that contributed to modern human ancestry, but for which we have no fossil or archaeological record. They're visible only in our DNA, like shadows cast by people who left no other trace. The genetic signatures suggest that at least one, possibly several, of these ghost populations split from other human lineages extremely early. We're talking divergence times of 500,000 years ago or more. These populations remained separate, evolving in isolation, then later mixed back in with other African populations. Where were these ghost populations? What did they look like? We have no idea. They might have lived in regions of Africa that are now underwater or covered by desert. They might have been small, isolated groups that barely survived but contributed crucial genetic innovations. Or they might have been large populations that dominated certain regions but happened to leave no fossils in places we've looked. This is one of the most profound mysteries in human evolution. We know these populations existed. The math is clear. Their genetic signature is written in modern genomes, but we can't see them directly. They're ghosts haunting our family tree. Some researchers think Homo naledi might represent one of these lineages. This strange human species, discovered in South Africa and dated to between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago, had a bizarre mix of features. Primitive in some ways, surprisingly modern in others. Small-brained but potentially capable of complex behaviors. Living in Africa at the exact time when modern humans were supposedly evolving. Did Homo sapiens interbreed with Homo naledi? The genetic evidence suggests some kind of archaic admixture in African populations, meaning modern humans mixed with more archaic human species. Naledi is a candidate. So is Homo heidelbergensis, the large-brained archaic human that was widespread in Africa before Homo sapiens emerged. So are other species we haven't discovered yet. This creates a picture of Ice Age Africa that's far more complex than we ever imagined. Instead of one human species evolving in isolation, you have multiple human species and populations coexisting. They're occupying different ecological niches, developing different adaptations, probably competing for resources, but they're also occasionally interacting, and when they do, genes flow between them. The same thing was happening in Eurasia. We know Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with each other and with modern humans. We know there were other archaic populations in Asia that left genetic traces. The pattern is global. Wherever different human populations met, they mixed. Why did we think Africa would be different? Probably because we didn't have the evidence yet. The focus of paleoanthropology has long been on Europe and Asia, where preservation conditions are better and where Neanderthal studies drove much of the research. Africa, despite being humanity's birthplace, has been understudied. Large regions have never been systematically surveyed for fossils. Many sites have been destroyed by development or erosion. The genetic studies are filling in these gaps, telling us about populations we can't see directly. And what they're revealing is a vision of human origins that's messy, complicated, and utterly fascinating. Consider the San people of southern Africa, the indigenous hunter-gatherers who've lived in and around the Kalahari Desert for tens of thousands of years. Genetic studies show they represent one of the deepest lineages of modern humans. Their ancestors split from other human populations as early as 350,000 years ago and remained relatively isolated, maintaining genetic distinctiveness until recently. Ancient DNA from southern African individuals who lived thousands of years ago shows even greater genetic uniqueness. Some of these ancient people had gene variants that don't exist in any living humans today. They represent extinct lineages, branches of the human family tree that once flourished but eventually disappeared as populations mixed and demographics shifted. This is sobering. We're not just missing fossils of extinct species, we're missing entire lineages of Homo sapiens. Populations that were as human as we are, but which died out, leaving only genetic echoes in modern genomes. How many other such lineages existed? How much diversity has been lost? The structured population model helps explain another puzzle that bothered researchers for years. Why did modern human morphology, the way we look physically, seem to vary so much in early fossils? You'd find skulls that looked very modern in some features but archaic in others. Different fossils emphasize different traits. The variations seem to defy easy classification. Under the single origin model, this was hard to explain. If everyone descended from one small population, there should be less variation, not more. But under the structured model, it makes perfect sense. Different populations had been evolving semi-independently. They'd accumulated different features. When they mixed, you'd get individuals showing various combinations of these features. The variation wasn't noise, it was signal, evidence of the complex demographic history. Archaeological evidence supports this picture too. The Middle Stone Age, that sophisticated tool technology found at Jebel Irhoud and sites across Africa, wasn't uniform. Different regions developed their own variants. Some emphasized certain types of points, others developed specialized tools for processing specific resources. But there were also similarities, suggesting cultural exchange between regions. You see this in symbolic behaviors too. Shell beads appear at multiple sites across Africa, but they're not identical. Different populations were innovating independently, developing their own traditions of personal ornamentation. It's exactly what you'd expect from a structured population with partial connectivity. Climate data adds another layer to the story. Africa's climate during the Pleistocene was dramatically unstable. Wet periods alternated with severe droughts. Forests expanded and contracted. Deserts formed and disappeared. The Sahara, now the world's largest hot desert, was periodically green and habitable. These climate shifts would have profoundly affected human populations. During wet periods, habitable zones expanded, populations grew and spread. Different groups came into contact. Gene flow increased. But during dry periods, populations fragmented. Barriers appeared between regions. Groups became isolated. Genetic drift and local adaptation became stronger. This dynamic, populations fragmenting and reuniting repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years, is precisely what creates the structured pattern we see in genetic data. It's a pump, mixing and separating, generating diversity, and then homogenizing it, over and over. And it means that trying to pinpoint a single origin point for Homo sapiens is probably futile. Our species doesn't have a birthplace. It has birthplaces, plural. Or more accurately, it has a birth continent. Africa as a whole was the cradle of modern humanity, not any specific region within it. This is the Pan-African Revolution. The recognition that human origins were never simple, never localized, never as clean as we wanted them to be. The evidence has been pushing us toward this conclusion for years. The Jebel Irhoud discovery accelerated it. The genetic studies confirmed it. Now the question is what it means for how we understand ourselves. Because if humans didn't evolve in one place, if we're the product of multiple populations mixing over hundreds of thousands of years, then many of our assumptions about human evolution need to be revised. Questions about when modern cognition emerged, about what makes us unique, about how and why certain traits evolved. All of these become more complex when you don't have a single origin point to work from. But it also makes the story richer, more human, somehow. We're not the descendants of one small group that got lucky. We're the product of an entire continent's worth of human diversity. Multiple populations, each contributing their own innovations, their own adaptations, their own genetic and cultural heritage to the modern human story. And that story was about to get even more complicated, because the populations that left Africa didn't leave it cleanly. They mixed with other humans outside the continent too, and those encounters would reshape the human genome in ways we're only beginning to understand. In 2010, a team of scientists published something extraordinary. They'd sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal, extracted from a 40,000-year-old bone found in a cave in Croatia. It was a technical marvel, recovering ancient DNA that had been degrading for millennia and piecing it together into a readable sequence. But the real shock came when they compared that Neanderthal genome to modern human genomes from around the world. Because they found something that wasn't supposed to be there. Neanderthal DNA. In us. In modern humans. Not in everyone, but in everyone whose ancestors came from outside Africa. Europeans had it. Asians had it. Native Americans had it. Only sub-Saharan Africans lacked it. The implications were immediate and profound. The out-of-Africa model, at least in its purest form, predicted complete replacement. Modern humans were supposed to have left Africa and replaced Neanderthals without interbreeding. Two separate species that didn't mix. But the genetic evidence said otherwise. We had mixed. Extensively. Today we know that non-African populations carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. That might not sound like much, but it represents millions of years of evolution in a different lineage. Neanderthals had been evolving separately from modern humans for 500,000 years, adapting to Ice Age Europe, developing their own unique characteristics. And when the two species met, probably somewhere in the Middle East between 50 and 60,000 years ago, they didn't just compete, they mated. The children of those unions survived. They had children of their own. Those Neanderthal genes spread through expanding human populations, carrying with them adaptations that had evolved in very different environments. Some of those genes turned out to be useful. Variants that helped with immune function, with adapting to cold climates, with processing certain foods. Natural selection preserved them. Other Neanderthal genes were harmful in modern human genetic backgrounds. They increased susceptibility to certain diseases, affected fertility, created health problems. These were gradually weeded out by selection. But the process took time, and even today, we're still carrying Neanderthal genetic variants that affect our health, our appearance, even our behavior. Then in 2011, another bombshell. Researchers were studying a tiny finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. Initial analysis of its mitochondrial DNA showed it didn't match either modern humans or Neanderthals. It was something else entirely. When they sequenced the full genome, they discovered a third human species that had been living in Asia while Neanderthals occupied Europe and modern humans were emerging in Africa. They called them Denisovans, after the cave where they were found, and we still know almost nothing about what they looked like. The physical remains are scanty. A finger bone, a few teeth, scraps of skull. Not enough to reconstruct their appearance with any confidence. But their genetic legacy tells a fascinating story. Modern humans interbred with Denisovans too. Not just once, but multiple times, in different places, with different Denisovan populations. Today, people of Oceanian ancestry, including indigenous Australians, Papuans, and some Southeast Asian populations, carry between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA, significantly more than the Neanderthal contribution in other populations. This means that as modern humans spread across Asia, they encountered Denisovans and mixed with them, probably in multiple waves, possibly over tens of thousands of years. The genetic signatures suggest at least 2 distinct episodes of Denisovan interbreeding, maybe more. Different groups of modern humans mixing with different groups of Denisovans at different times. And Denisovans weren't just mixing with us, they were mixing with Neanderthals too. One of the most remarkable discoveries from Denisova Cave was a bone fragment that, when analysed, turned out to be from a first-generation hybrid, a teenager whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. The fact that we found this hybrid at all is astounding. Think about the odds. Hundreds of thousands of years of human history, millions of individuals living and dying, and we found the actual bone of someone who was literally half one species and half another. Either such hybrids were more common than we imagine, or we got incredibly lucky. Probably both. The more we look, the more evidence we find for interbreeding between different human populations. It's starting to look less like rare exceptions and more like a general pattern. When different human groups met, they mixed. Species boundaries were fuzzy, permeable. Biology didn't prevent interbreeding even after hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. But here's where it gets really wild. The Denisovan genome itself shows evidence of admixture from an even more archaic population. Researchers call them super-archaics because they split from other human lineages over 1 million years ago. We have no idea what these super-archaics were. Homo erectus? Some other species we haven't discovered? All we know is that their DNA ended up in Denisovans, and through them, in some modern humans. So the genetic story looks something like this. Multiple populations of archaic humans had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. These populations occasionally interbred with each other. Then modern humans arrived from Africa, probably in multiple waves, and they interbred with the archaic populations they encountered. The resulting mixed populations expanded, carrying genes from multiple sources, and eventually became the ancestors of everyone alive today outside Africa. Except that's not quite right either. Because in 2020, researchers made another discovery. They found Neanderthal DNA in African populations. Not much, only about 0.3%, but it was there, which meant gene flow hadn't just been one way, out of Africa. It had flowed back in too. This makes sense when you think about it. The Middle East and North Africa are geographically continuous. Modern humans leaving Africa would have passed through these regions. Some would have mixed with Neanderthals, then migrated back into Africa, bringing Neanderthal genes with them. Back migration probably happened multiple times over tens of thousands of years. So even the idea that Africans represent some kind of pure, unmixed modern human population isn't quite accurate. Everyone alive today, everywhere on Earth, is a mixture. We all carry genes from multiple source populations. From modern humans and archaic humans and populations we can't even identify yet. The genetic picture that emerges from all this research is dizzyingly complex. Human evolution wasn't a tree with clean branches separating species. It was a braided stream, populations splitting and merging, diverging and reconnecting, exchanging genes across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of miles. And the admixture had functional consequences. Some of the Neanderthal genes that modern humans acquired provided real advantages. Immune system genes, for instance. Neanderthals had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, exposed to different pathogens than African populations encountered. When modern humans mixed with Neanderthals, they acquired genes that had been tested by natural selection in Eurasian disease environments. Similarly, Denisovan genes contributed adaptations for high-altitude living. Tibetans today carry a Denisovan variant of a gene called EPAS, one that helps them thrive in low-oxygen environments. This gene is virtually absent in lowland populations but nearly fixed in Tibetans. It's one of the strongest signals of natural selection in the human genome, and it came from Denisovans. Inuit populations carry Denisovan genes that help them process fatty diets more efficiently. Pacific Islanders may have Denisovan adaptations for their maritime lifestyle. In each case, archaic admixture provided genetic variation that modern human populations then adapted to their local environments. But admixture had costs too. Neanderthal genes have been linked to increased risk of certain diseases, depression, skin conditions, blood clotting disorders, even addiction. This probably reflects genetic incompatibilities. Genes that worked fine in Neanderthal genetic backgrounds sometimes caused problems when mixed into modern human genomes. Natural selection has been working to purge the most harmful variants. Regions of the genome involved in fertility and brain development are depleted of Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting that Neanderthal genes in these regions were strongly disadvantageous. We're still carrying archaic variants that affect our health and biology in complex ways. The story gets even messier when you look at specific genes. Different modern human populations retain different archaic variants. Europeans carry some Neanderthal genes that Asians don't. East Asians have Denisovan variants that Melanesians lack. This means that genetic variation between modern human populations isn't just the result of recent evolution after leaving Africa. It's also the result of mixing with different archaic populations in different places. Part of the reason people from different regions look different is because their ancestors mixed with different archaic humans. Let that sink in for a moment. Physical variation in modern humans, the traits we often call racial differences, they're partly the result of ancient interbreeding with other human species. Skin color, hair texture, facial features, some of this variation comes from our archaic heritage. This completely scrambles simplistic ideas about race and human difference. We're all mixtures. We all carry archaic DNA. We're all products of interbreeding between modern and archaic populations. The idea of pure human lineages is nonsense. It's always been nonsense, but now we have genetic proof. The timeline of these mixing events is complex too. The main Neanderthal interbreeding probably happened between 50 and 60,000 years ago, shortly after modern humans left Africa. But there's evidence for earlier gene flow as well. Some Neanderthal DNA in modern genomes appears to have entered the population over 100,000 years ago, suggesting very early contact between the groups. Denisovan admixture happened later, maybe 40 to 50,000 years ago, as modern humans pushed deeper into Asia. But different populations mixed at different times. The Denisovan DNA in Papuans came from one event. The Denisovan DNA in East Asians came from a different event, with a different Denisovan population. And there are hints of other admixture events we can't fully resolve yet. Genetic signatures that suggest mixing with populations we haven't identified. Ghost species that contributed to our genome but left no other trace. One study found evidence for admixture from a population that split from other humans over 1 million years ago. This population contributed DNA to modern West African populations. Who were they? We don't know. Could they be Homo naledi or Homo heidelbergensis or some other archaic African species? Maybe. But without ancient DNA from those species, we can't be sure. What we can say is that human evolution involved far more mixing than anyone anticipated. The boundaries between species were permeable. Gene flow was common. Our genome is a mosaic assembled from multiple sources across hundreds of thousands of years. And this has profound implications for how we think about human origins. Because if modern humans were mixing with archaic populations both inside and outside Africa, if gene flow was multidirectional and ongoing, then the whole concept of a clean, out-of-Africa migration starts to break down. Maybe there wasn't one migration. Maybe there were many, in both directions, over a long time period. Maybe the process of becoming modern human wasn't a discrete event, but a gradual transformation involving multiple populations on multiple continents. This is where the genetic evidence starts pointing towards something radical. Not that the out-of-Africa theory is completely wrong, but that it's been asking the wrong questions. The question isn't when did modern humans leave Africa? It's when did populations inside and outside Africa stop exchanging genes frequently enough that we can call them separate lineages? And the answer might be much more recent than anyone thought. Some researchers now argue that human populations were connected across Africa and into Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. That the Sahara and other barriers weren't absolute. That gene flow, while sporadic, was ongoing. That the modern human genome was being assembled across multiple continents simultaneously. If this is true, then the out-of-Africa question becomes less about a single migration event and more about understanding a complex demographic history involving multiple populations, multiple migrations in both directions, and extensive mixing both inside and outside the continent. The genetic bombshell didn't just reveal that we mixed with Neanderthals and Denisovans. It revealed that human evolution is fundamentally a story of mixture, of populations coming together and exchanging genes, of species boundaries being crossed and recrossed. We are, all of us, hybrids, and that changes everything. The classic out-of-Africa narrative tells a simple story about when modern humans left the continent. Around 70,000 years ago, a small group crossed into the Middle East, probably through the Sinai Peninsula or across the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. From there, they spread rapidly across Eurasia and eventually the entire world. One exodus. One moment when our ancestors stepped out of Africa and began their conquest of the globe. Except the archaeological evidence never quite fit this timeline, and the more researchers dug, the more evidence they found that humans had left Africa much, much earlier. In 2018, a team of researchers published findings from Mislia Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Israel. They'd found a jawbone, a maxilla with several teeth still attached, in sediments that could be reliably dated. When they analyzed the bone and the sediments around it, they got a date that shocked the scientific community. Between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago, nearly 200,000 years old, making it the oldest modern human fossil ever found outside of Africa. And it wasn't just sitting there alone. The jawbone was associated with sophisticated stone tools, evidence of fire use, and animal bones showing systematic hunting. These weren't humans just passing through. They were living there, thriving there. This discovery pushed the out of Africa timeline back by at least 80,000 years. Suddenly, that 70,000-year-old migration didn't look like the first time humans left Africa. It looked like maybe the last successful attempt, or at least the one that led to permanent settlement. Because here's the thing about the Mislia Cave humans. Their descendants apparently didn't make it. When we look at modern human genomes, we don't see evidence of a major expansion from the Middle East 200,000 years ago. Whatever population these people represented, they either died out or were absorbed back into African populations or contributed only minimally to later humans. This suggests that humans tried to leave Africa multiple times. Some attempts failed. Populations died out or retreated. Climate shifts, competition with Neanderthals, disease, bad luck, any number of factors could have doomed these early expansions. But the attempts kept happening. Humans kept pushing into the Middle East, testing the boundaries of their range. The Mislia discovery wasn't alone. Other sites in the Levant, the region encompassing modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, have yielded evidence of modern humans dating back over 100,000 years. Skul and Kafzeh caves, excavated in the early 20th century, contained skeletons that looked modern and were eventually dated to between 90,000 and 120,000 years old. For decades, researchers didn't know what to make of these fossils. They seemed too old given the supposed timeline of human expansion. Some scientists argued they represented an early failed migration. Others suggested they might not be fully modern humans but rather some kind of transitional population. The debate raged for years with no clear resolution. Now, with Mislia and new genetic evidence, a picture is emerging. Humans were leaving Africa repeatedly, starting at least 200,000 years ago. They made sophisticated tools, they hunted successfully, they created art and practiced burial rituals. They were, by any measure, behaviorally modern. But they didn't expand beyond the Middle East. Or if they did, they left no trace we've found yet. Something kept them confined to the Levant. Maybe it was climate. The period between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago was characterized by dramatic climate instability. Ice ages advanced and retreated, deserts expanded, habitable zones shifted. A population that established itself during a warm period might find itself cut off and dying during a cold snap. Or maybe it was competition. Neanderthals were well established in Europe and parts of the Middle East. They'd been there for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. Modern humans coming from tropical Africa might have struggled to compete. The early expansions might have been pushed back, confined to marginal territories, eventually absorbed or eliminated. Whatever the reason, these early populations didn't lead to the peopling of the world. That came later. But their existence tells us something important. The urge to expand, to explore, to push into new territories, it's old. It's been part of human behavior for at least 200,000 years. We've been migrating, exploring, testing boundaries since the very beginning of our species. And the exits from Africa might have been even more complex than just multiple failed attempts followed by one success. Some researchers now argue for a model involving continuous or near-continuous gene flow between African and Middle Eastern populations for hundreds of thousands of years. Think about the geography. The Sinai Peninsula directly connects Africa to Asia. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, at the southern end of the Red Sea, is narrow, only about 20 miles across at its narrowest point. During Ice Age low sea levels, it would have been even narrower, possibly just a few miles. These aren't insurmountable barriers. They're highways. Human populations probably moved back and forth across these connections regularly. During good times, when resources were abundant, populations would expand out of Africa. During hard times, they might retreat. Adaptations evolved in the Middle East might flow back into Africa. This model explains some puzzling features of the archaeological record. Middle Stone Age technology, that sophisticated tool tradition found at Jebel Irhoud and across Africa, also appears in the Levant around the same time. Did it develop independently? Did it spread from Africa? Or were African and Middle Eastern populations part of a single, large, geographically structured population that shared cultural innovations? Similarly, symbolic behaviors like ochre use and shell bead production appear in both Africa and the Middle East during overlapping time periods. This could indicate parallel evolution, or it could indicate cultural exchange between connected populations. The genetic evidence is starting to support this continuous contact model. Studies of ancient DNA from Neanderthals show that they received gene flow from modern humans or modern human ancestors multiple times over a 100,000-year period. This suggests repeated contact, populations meeting and mixing, then separating, then meeting again. And the direction of gene flow wasn't just out of Africa. Recent studies have found evidence for back migration into Africa. Populations that had left acquired new genetic variants, perhaps mixed with archaic populations, then returned to Africa, bringing those variants with them. The boundary between Africa and Eurasia was permeable, crossed and recrossed. This completely changes how we think about human dispersal. Instead of one dramatic exodus, one moment when we left our homeland forever, it's a story of gradual expansion and contraction, of populations pushing out during favorable periods and retreating during unfavorable ones, of continuous demographic connections maintained across hundreds of thousands of years. The final successful expansion, the one that led to the permanent settlement of Eurasia and eventually the whole world, probably happened around 60 to 70,000 years ago. But it wasn't the first attempt. It might not even have been the 10th. It was just the one that worked. The one where humans finally pushed past the Middle East and into the rest of Asia and Europe. What made this expansion different? Why did it succeed where earlier ones failed? We don't know for certain. Maybe climate conditions were particularly favorable. Maybe human populations had reached a critical size or developed crucial cultural innovations. Maybe they'd mixed with archaic populations and acquired genes that helped them adapt to new environments. Maybe it was just luck, being in the right place at the right time with the right combination of traits. But once it started, it happened fast. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that modern humans spread across southern Asia and reached Australia by around 65,000 years ago. They pushed into Europe between 50 and 45,000 years ago. They crossed into the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This expansion involved multiple routes. The traditional model emphasized a coastal route, humans following the shorelines of the Indian Ocean, exploiting marine resources, island hopping through Southeast Asia to Australia. There's good evidence for this. Archaeological sites along this route show early human presence, and modern populations in this region carry genetic signatures of an early expansion. But there were inland routes too, humans pushing north into Central Asia, following river valleys, adapting to steppe environments. These populations eventually reached Siberia and crossed into the Americas. They also pushed west into Europe, displacing or absorbing Neanderthals. Different populations took different routes at different times. They carried different genetic variants, different cultural traditions, different adaptations. When they met, they mixed, creating the complex genetic landscape we see in modern humans. East Asians are descended from populations that took northern routes, Oceanians from populations that took southern coastal routes, Europeans from populations that pushed west from the Middle East and Central Asia. But all of these expansions, all of these routes, they built on those earlier failed attempts. The humans who reached Mislia Cave 200,000 years ago, who lived there for thousands of years before disappearing, they were testing the route, learning the terrain, adapting to new challenges. When later populations followed the same paths, they were following in ancestral footsteps, even if the ancestors themselves had long since vanished. This raises a profound question. How many other early expansions happened that we don't know about? The Mislia cave jawbone survived because it was in a cave, protected from the elements, in a region where archaeologists happened to look. But how many other sites, other fossils, other populations, lived and died without leaving traces we've found? Tropical and coastal regions have terrible fossil preservation. Organic material decays rapidly. How many early human populations lived along shorelines that are now underwater? How many times did humans push into Southeast Asia or across to Australia only to have those populations die out or be overwritten by later arrivals? The genetic evidence suggests there might be multiple ghost populations, groups that contributed to modern human ancestry, but which we can't identify through fossils or archaeology. They're visible only as statistical shadows in genomic data. Could some of these be early, out-of-Africa populations that mixed with later groups? It's possible. It's even likely. Human history is far messier than we usually acknowledge. Populations expanded and contracted constantly. Climate shifts, disease, competition, all created demographic turbulence. Many lineages went extinct. Many migrations failed. The populations we descend from aren't the only ones who tried. They're just the ones who succeeded. And success was probably contingent. Small differences in timing, in route choice, in the genetic variants a population happened to carry, these could mean the difference between flourishing and vanishing. The humans who left Africa 70,000 years ago and successfully populated the world weren't necessarily smarter or better adapted than those who tried earlier. They might have just been luckier. This is a humbling thought. Our existence as a species, our spread across the planet, our eventual dominance of global ecosystems, it all depended on countless contingencies. If the Mislia cave population had succeeded instead of the later expansion, we might all be their descendants instead. If climate conditions had been slightly different, humans might never have left Africa at all. If any of 1,000 variables had gone differently, we wouldn't be here wondering about our origins. But here we are, products of multiple expansions, multiple migrations, multiple populations, mixing across hundreds of thousands of years. Our genomes carry traces of all of it, the failed attempts and the successful ones, the populations that vanished and those that thrived. We're walking archives of human demographic history, if we can learn to read the record properly. And the more we read, the more complex the story becomes. Because the exits from Africa weren't the only mysteries. What happened after humans left, how they interacted with the populations they encountered, how they adapted to new environments, all of this is still being worked out. And the fossil record, as we'll see, has massive gaps in exactly the places we most need evidence. Here's something that keeps paleoanthropologists awake at night. We have better fossil evidence of Tyrannosaurus rex, which lived 66 million years ago, than we do of our own ancestors from 100,000 years ago. A dinosaur that went extinct when an asteroid slammed into Earth is better represented in museums than the humans who were living just a geological eye blink ago. This isn't because dinosaurs were more common, or because paleontologists have tried harder to find them. It's because fossilization is spectacularly, almost impossibly rare, and the environments where our ancestors lived were particularly bad at preserving bones. Let's start with the basics. For something to fossilize, it needs to die in exactly the right place, be buried quickly before scavengers and weathering destroy it, stay buried in sediment with the right chemical composition to mineralize the bones, remain undisturbed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and then somehow get exposed by erosion or excavation at just the right moment for someone to find it before it erodes away completely. Each of those steps is unlikely. String them all together, and you're looking at odds so long that most organisms that ever lived left no fossil trace whatsoever. Paleontologists estimate that we've discovered less than 1% of all species that ever existed. For some time periods and environments, it's far less than that. Now consider where early humans lived. Tropical and subtropical Africa, Warm, wet environments with acidic soils that dissolve bones, dense vegetation that covers and disturbs burial sites, active geology that fractures and destroys rock layers. These are fossil preservation nightmares. Compare that to the European sites where Neanderthal fossils are found. Limestone caves that protect bones from weathering, alkaline soils that help preserve organic material, cold, dry conditions that slow decomposition. The difference in preservation is dramatic. We have hundreds of Neanderthal specimens from Europe, we have a handful of early Homo Sapiens specimens from Africa, and most of those are fragmentary. This creates massive bias in what we know. We understand Neanderthal anatomy in detail because we have so many specimens. We can track regional variation, individual differences, changes over time. But for early Homo sapiens, we're often working with single individuals separated by tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Trying to understand the full range of variation in our species from such limited samples is like trying to understand human diversity today by examining 3 random people from different continents. The gaps are most severe in Central and West Africa, regions that were certainly occupied by early humans, but where tropical conditions make fossil preservation nearly impossible. The Congo Basin, the West African forests. These might have been home to large populations for hundreds of thousands of years, but the acidic soil, the humidity, the jungle vegetation, all conspire to destroy bone before it can fossilize. This is where the ghost populations revealed by genetics probably lived. We know they existed, their DNA signatures are clear, but we'll likely never find their bones because the environment destroyed them long before we could look. Even in regions with better preservation, like East Africa, the record is patchy. The Great Rift Valley has produced many important fossils, but that's partly because it's been intensively studied for over a century. Teams of researchers have surveyed the same areas repeatedly, finding new sites, excavating systematically. But the Rift Valley is tiny compared to the rest of Africa. Vast regions have never been adequately surveyed. And surveying is expensive, difficult, often dangerous work. You're walking through remote areas, often in extreme heat, scanning eroding hillsides and exposed rock faces for tiny fragments of bone. You might search for years without finding anything significant. The vast majority of fossils weather out of sediment, sit exposed for a few years or decades, then erode to dust. The window for discovery is brief. Political instability makes things worse. Some of the most promising regions for finding early human fossils are in countries affected by conflict or lacking infrastructure for scientific research. Yemen, Somalia, parts of the Sahel, the interior of the Congo. These places probably hold fossils we desperately need, but they're effectively inaccessible to researchers. Then there's the problem of dating. Even when we find fossils, determining their age is often difficult. The gold standard is radiometric dating of volcanic ash layers above and below the fossil. But this only works if there are volcanic deposits, which limits where we can get precise dates. Other methods have larger margins of error or work only on certain materials. This means that even for fossils we have, the chronology is often uncertain. Did this skull live 150,000 years ago or 200,000? The difference matters enormously for understanding human evolution, but sometimes we just can't pin it down more precisely than a 50,000-year range. The Jebel Irhoud fossils are unusual precisely because they could be dated so well. The burnt flint allowed for precise thermoluminescence dating. The multiple samples gave consistent results, but many sites lack such ideal dating materials. Researchers do the best they can with what's available, but the uncertainty is frustrating. Preservation also affects what parts of skeletons survive. Skulls, being compact and dense, fossilize more readily than other bones. This creates bias toward cranial material. We might have several skulls from a time period but no limb bones, making it hard to reconstruct body proportions or determine how these people moved. The few complete or near-complete skeletons we have are treasured precisely because they're so rare. Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis skeleton from Ethiopia, is famous partly because 40% of her skeleton survived. Most early human fossils are fragments: a jawbone, a few teeth, a piece of skull. Paleoanthropologists become adept at extracting information from minimal material, but there are limits to what fragmentary fossils can tell us. This is why every major discovery rewrites parts of the human story. We're not refining a well-understood picture. We're adding data points to a record so sparse that each new fossil changes the overall pattern. The Jebel Irhoud discovery pushed human origins back 100,000 years. Future discoveries could push it back further or reveal populations we don't know about yet. Consider how many human species we've discovered in just the last few decades. Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied hobbit people from Indonesia, announced in 2004. Homo naledi from South Africa, announced in 2015. The Denisovans, known only from genetics and a handful of bone fragments. Each discovery was a complete surprise. We had no idea these species existed. How many other species are we missing? How many lineages evolved, thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, then went extinct without leaving fossils in places we've looked? The fossil record represents a tiny biased sample of extinct biodiversity. For every species we've found, there might be 10 we haven't. This is particularly true for the crucial transition period between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago. When modern human features were evolving, we have a few fossils from this period, but nowhere near enough to understand the process fully. Are these different species? Different populations of the same species? Regional variants? We can't tell from such limited evidence. The genetic data suggests there were multiple distinct populations across Africa during this period. Some of these eventually merged to form modern Homo sapiens. Others went extinct. But we can't match most of the genetic signatures to specific fossils because we don't have enough fossils to work with. Ancient DNA could help, but it survives poorly in African climates. The oldest African human DNA successfully sequenced is only about 15,000 years old, from individuals in Morocco. Genetic material degrades rapidly in heat and humidity. The Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes we've sequenced come from cold, dry environments where DNA preservation is better. In Africa, where we most need ancient genomes to understand human origins, we probably won't get them from fossils older than 20 or 30,000 years. This forces researchers to rely on modern DNA to infer ancient population structure. But there are limits to how far back you can see, and the further back you go, the more uncertain the inferences become. Ancient DNA would provide direct evidence of what early Homo sapiens genomes looked like, but we may never have access to it. The situation is even worse for behavior. Fossils can tell us what humans looked like, but behavior rarely fossilizes. We can infer some things from tool technologies, from evidence of fire use, from burial practices, but complex behaviors like language, social organization, symbolic thought, these leave minimal traces. We're forced to speculate based on indirect evidence. Did the Jebel Irhoud humans have language? Their brains were organized differently from ours, which might suggest different cognitive capabilities. But brain shape doesn't directly tell us about language capacity. The anatomical requirements for speech, the descended larynx, the precise control of breathing, these don't fossilize well. We can make educated guesses, but we can't be certain. What about art and symbolism? The earliest unambiguous art from Africa dates to around 75,000 years ago. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Earlier art might have been made from perishable materials or in forms we don't recognize. Rock art could have eroded away. Symbolic behaviors might have existed but left no archaeological signature. The gaps extend to understanding how humans lived day to day. What did they eat? How did they organize their societies? How large were their groups? What were their social relationships like? Archaeological sites can provide some answers, but most are partial and ambiguous. We find stone tools, which tells us something about technological capabilities. We find animal bones, which tells us about diet. But the full richness of human life, everything that made these people human, it's mostly lost. And then there's the biggest gap of all. The transition from archaic to modern. We know it happened. We can see the before and after, but the actual process, the changes that occurred generation by generation, individual by individual, as populations gradually accumulated modern traits, that's invisible to us. We don't have continuous fossil sequences showing small incremental changes. We have snapshots separated by enormous time gaps. Imagine trying to understand how a child grows by seeing photographs at age 2, age 10, and aged 20. You'd see they got bigger, their proportions changed, their features matured, but you'd miss all the details, the growth spurts, the gradual changes, the individual variation. That's where we are with human evolution. We see the big picture, but miss the details. Some researchers are trying to fill gaps through other means. Comparative anatomy, studying living primates to understand what early humans might have been capable of. Experimental archaeology, recreating ancient tools and techniques to understand the skills required. Computer modeling, using simulations to test different evolutionary scenarios. These approaches help, but they can't replace actual fossils. The sad reality is that some gaps will never be filled. Some fossils have been destroyed by geological processes. Some lived in environments that prevent fossilization. Some are buried in places we'll never access. The evidence is gone, not just missing but permanently lost. No amount of searching will recover what no longer exists. This creates fundamental limits on what we can know about human origins. We'll never have a complete picture. We'll never know exactly when and where every human trait evolved. We'll never meet all the populations that contributed to modern humans. Large parts of our origin story are lost to time, and we have to accept that, but we keep looking anyway, because every fossil matters. Every discovery, no matter how fragmentary, adds to our understanding. The Mislia cave jawbone was just a single bone, but it pushed the out of Africa timeline back 80,000 years. The Jebel Irhoud skulls were fragmentary, but they revolutionized our understanding of when and where our species emerged. Even small finds can have enormous impacts. And new technologies are helping. High-resolution dating methods can pin down ages more precisely. Isotope analysis can determine what ancient humans ate and where they lived. Ancient protein analysis might eventually let us study evolution in fossils too old for DNA preservation. The tools are getting better, even if the fossil record remains stubbornly sparse. So we work with what we have. We acknowledge the gaps honestly. We're transparent about uncertainty. We build our theories on the evidence that exists, knowing that new discoveries will inevitably require revisions. It's frustrating, but it's also what makes paleoanthropology fascinating. We're detectives working on a case where most of the evidence has been destroyed, and we have to solve it anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, we get lucky. Someone finds a cave that's been sealed for hundreds of thousands of years, or discovers a lake bed with perfect preservation, or stumbles across a site no one thought to look before. And suddenly, we have new data, new insights, new pieces of the puzzle. Those moments make all the patient, frustrating work worthwhile, because understanding where we came from matters. It matters scientifically, helping us understand evolution and human biology. It matters culturally, shaping how we think about human diversity and our place in nature. It matters philosophically, addressing fundamental questions about what makes us human. Despite the gaps, despite the missing evidence, despite knowing we'll never have complete answers, we keep searching. Because the quest to understand our origins is itself deeply human. In December of 2024, a Chinese evolutionary biologist named Huang Shi published a paper that sent shockwaves through the paleoanthropology community. Not because he'd discovered new fossils or sequenced ancient DNA, but because he challenged something that Western science had considered settled for decades. He argued that modern humans didn't originate in Africa at all. They originated in East Asia. To most researchers, this sounded absurd. The genetic evidence overwhelmingly points to Africa. The oldest, clearly modern human fossils come from Africa. The archaeological record shows symbolic behaviors emerging first in Africa. How could anyone seriously propose an East Asian origin? But Huang wasn't some fringe crank. He'd spent nearly 3 decades at universities in the United States before returning to China. And he was arguing that Western scientists had been interpreting it through a biased lens, overlooking data that didn't fit their preconceptions about human origins. His argument centered on a controversial observation. East Asian populations have the lowest genetic diversity of any major human group. Under the standard out of Africa model, this makes sense. East Asia is far from Africa. Populations that migrated there went through multiple founder events, losing genetic variation with each step. Low diversity equals recent arrival from elsewhere. But Huang flipped this logic. He argued that low diversity actually indicates antiquity, that East Asian populations represent the original human lineage, with other populations having gained diversity through admixture with archaic humans. Africa has high diversity not because humans originated there, but because African populations mixed extensively with archaic species. To support this, he pointed to fossil evidence from China. Skulls and bones that some Chinese researchers interpret as showing continuity between archaic and modern populations in the region, features that appear in both ancient Chinese fossils and modern East Asian populations, suggesting direct ancestry rather than replacement. The Dali skull from China, dated to around 200,000 years ago. The Jinyushan skeleton from northeastern China. The Maba cranium. These and other fossils show, according to some interpretations, a mix of archaic and modern features that could represent a transitional population evolving toward modern humans. This is essentially a revival of the multi-regional hypothesis, the theory that modern humans evolved simultaneously in multiple regions from local archaic populations. This idea was popular in the mid-20th century, but fell out of favor when genetic evidence seemed to decisively support African origins. The multi-regional model, in its classic form, proposed that after Homo erectus spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia nearly 2 million years ago, populations in different regions evolved toward modern Homo sapiens in parallel. Gene flow between regions prevented them from becoming separate species, but regional differences persisted. Modern Europeans descended primarily from European archaic humans, modern Africans from African archaics. The genetic evidence demolished this simple version of the theory. Mitochondrial DNA clearly shows African roots for all modern humans. The molecular clock dates converge on an African origin between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Nuclear DNA tells the same story. No matter how you analyze it, the genes point to Africa. But Huang and other proponents of Asian origins argue that genetic evidence can be interpreted differently, that assumptions about mutation rates, population sizes, and selection might be wrong, that the models Western geneticists use might not capture the full complexity of human demographic history. Most geneticists are deeply skeptical. The African origin signal in DNA is robust. It shows up in mitochondrial genes, Y chromosome genes, autosomal genes, in every type of genetic marker researchers have examined. Multiple independent methods using different assumptions all point to the same conclusion. The odds of all of them being wrong in the same way are vanishingly small. But there are genuine puzzles in the Asian fossil record that deserve attention. Some Chinese fossils do show continuity of certain traits. The shape of the incisors, for instance. Shovel-shaped incisors, where the back of the tooth is concave, appear in ancient Chinese fossils and are common in modern East Asian populations, but rare elsewhere. Does this indicate local continuity? Probably not. Shovel-shaped incisors also appear in some African populations and in Native Americans, who clearly descend from Asian migrants. It's a variable trait that can be selected for or against. Its presence in both ancient and modern populations might just be coincidence or convergent evolution, not proof of direct ancestry. Other traits show similar patterns. Facial flatness. Certain features of the skull base. These appear in both archaic Asian fossils and modern populations. But again, they could be adaptations to similar environments rather than evidence of continuous ancestry. The real problem with the Asian origin hypothesis is that it requires ignoring or reinterpreting massive amounts of evidence. Not just genetic data, but fossil evidence, archaeological patterns, paleoclimatic records. Everything would need to be wrong or misunderstood in very specific ways for the hypothesis to work. Why then does it persist? Partly because science has been dominated by Western institutions, and there's legitimate questioning of whether Western scientists have given Asian evidence fair consideration. Chinese researchers have been studying local fossils for decades, developing their own interpretations, which sometimes conflict with Western consensus. Language barriers don't help. Much of the Chinese paleoanthropological literature isn't translated into English. Western researchers often can't access or evaluate these studies. This creates parallel research traditions that sometimes talk past each other. There's also cultural pride involved. The idea that humanity originated in one's own region is appealing. Western science placed human origins in Africa, far from European and Asian population centers. Some Asian researchers bristle at this, seeing it as another instance of Western academic imperialism. But science isn't about pride or politics. It's about evidence. And the evidence overwhelmingly supports African origins for anatomically modern Homo sapiens. This doesn't mean Asian fossils are unimportant or that local research traditions should be dismissed. It means the out-of-Africa model, for all its complexities and recent revisions, remains the best explanation we have. That said, Asia did play a more important role in human evolution than the classic story acknowledged. We now know modern humans encountered and mixed with Denisovans across Asia. We know some Asian populations have significant Denisovan ancestry. We know there were probably multiple archaic human species in Asia that we haven't fully characterized yet. The Denisovan story is particularly intriguing because we know so little about them. A finger bone, some teeth, scraps of skull, that's all we have physically. But genetic analysis shows they were widespread across Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia to Oceania. They were diverse, with different populations separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Some researchers have suggested that fossils previously attributed to other species might actually be Denisovans. The Dali skull, the Harbin cranium recently described from northeastern China. These could potentially be Denisovan specimens. If confirmed through ancient DNA, it would give us our first good look at what Denisovans actually looked like. In 2025, researchers published analysis of the Harbin cranium, suggesting it might represent a new species, Homo longi, that could be more closely related to modern humans than Neanderthals were. Others argued it might be Denisovan. The debate is ongoing, but it highlights how much we still don't understand about human diversity in Asia. There were definitely archaic humans in Asia who looked different from Neanderthals and Denisovans. Homo erectus persisted in Asia until at least 100,000 years ago, possibly later. Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied hobbits, lived in Indonesia until 50,000 years ago or more. Homo luzonensis, from the Philippines, dates to at least 50,000 years ago. When modern humans arrived in Asia, probably between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, they encountered this diversity. Did they also mix with Homo erectus, with floresiensis, with other species we haven't identified? The genetic data hints at additional archaic admixture in Asian populations beyond Neanderthals and Denisovans, but we can't identify the source. So, while modern humans originated in Africa, they were profoundly shaped by their experiences in Asia. The genes they acquired from Denisovans helped them adapt to high altitudes, to island environments, to various climates and diets. Asian populations today are mosaics, carrying ancestry from African origins, Neanderthal encounters in the Middle East, and multiple episodes of Denisovan admixture across the continent. This doesn't validate the multi-regional hypothesis in its original form. Modern humans didn't evolve separately in multiple regions. But it does show that human evolution in Asia was complex, involving multiple species, extensive admixture, and adaptations that still affect people today. The challenge from East Asia, from researchers like Huang Shi, serves a useful purpose even if the core claim is wrong. It forces Western scientists to examine their assumptions, to consider whether they've overlooked evidence, to engage with research traditions they might have dismissed. Science benefits from such challenges, even when they ultimately fail. And there's a broader point about how we frame human origins. The question of where anatomically modern Homo sapiens first appeared is important, but it's not the only question worth asking. Where did specific human traits evolve? What selective pressures drove human evolution in different regions? How did different populations contribute to modern human diversity? These questions don't have simple geographic answers. Modern humans are a global species. Our origins involve Africa, certainly, but also Asia, Europe, the interactions between populations on multiple continents over hundreds of thousands of years. Trying to pinpoint a single birthplace misses the complexity of the actual process. Chinese researchers rightly point out that Asian populations have unique histories, unique adaptations, unique contributions to human diversity. These deserve study on their own terms, not just as footnotes to an African origin story. The fact that anatomically modern humans first appeared in Africa doesn't make African populations more fundamental or Asian populations less important. Every population alive today carries a genomic library of adaptations earned through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. African populations have adaptations to their environments. Asian populations have different ones, Europeans yet others. Each is equally valid, equally human, equally worthy of study. The Out of Africa theory, properly understood, isn't about African superiority or the marginalization of non-African populations. It's simply a statement about where a particular set of anatomical and genetic traits first appeared. It doesn't diminish the importance of what happened afterward: the global expansion, the local adaptations, the mixing with archaic populations. So when Chinese researchers challenge the theory, they're sometimes actually challenging a caricature, an oversimplified version that doesn't reflect current scientific understanding. Modern paleoanthropology acknowledges complexity, admixture, regional variation, the importance of non-African populations in shaping human evolution. But acknowledging complexity doesn't mean abandoning well-supported conclusions. Africa remains the best candidate for where anatomically modern Homo sapiens first appeared. The genetic evidence is too strong, too consistent, too thoroughly tested to dismiss. Future discoveries might add nuance, might push dates back further, might reveal previously unknown populations, but they're unlikely to overturn the basic African origin. The real frontier in human origins research isn't debating Africa versus Asia. It's understanding the details, the demographic history within Africa, the structure of populations before the global expansion, the timing and routes of migrations, the interactions with archaic humans, the evolution of modern cognition and behavior. These are the questions driving current research, and they require collaboration. African researchers, Asian researchers, European researchers, all bringing their expertise, their local knowledge, their perspectives to the table. The old model of Western scientists flying in to study exotic populations is rightly being challenged. The future of paleoanthropology needs to be truly international, truly collaborative. So while the East Asian challenge to Out of Africa doesn't succeed on its scientific merits, it succeeds in prompting important conversations about how we do science, who gets to interpret evidence, whose voices are heard in academic debates. That's valuable, even if it doesn't change the fundamental conclusion about where modern humans originated. So, where does all this leave us? We started with a simple story. Modern humans evolved in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, then left the continent 70,000 years ago to populate the world. Clean, straightforward, easy to teach in schools. Now the story is a mess. Humans with modern features living in Morocco 315,000 years ago, multiple distinct populations across Africa contributing to modern ancestry. Humans leaving Africa repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. Extensive mixing with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and mysterious ghost populations. Gene flow moving in multiple directions. The simple narrative has collapsed under the weight of new evidence. But here's the thing. The Out of Africa theory hasn't been disproven. It's been refined, complicated, made more accurate. The core insight remains valid. Modern humans did originate in Africa. The genetics are clear on this point. Every human alive today traces their primary ancestry to African populations that lived between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago. What's changed is our understanding of how that origin happened and what came after. Instead of a single population in a single location, we now recognize multiple populations across the continent. Instead of a single exodus, multiple migrations in both directions. Instead of complete replacement of archaic humans, extensive admixture. The story has become richer, more complex, more nuanced. Think of it this way. The old Out of Africa model was like a children's book version of history. Simple enough for easy comprehension, but missing most of the detail. What we're developing now is the adult version. More complicated, harder to summarize, but far more accurate and interesting. The current scientific consensus, if we can call it that given how rapidly things are changing, looks something like this. Between 350,000 and 300,000 years ago, multiple populations across Africa began developing features we recognize as modern. These populations were partially isolated from each other, separated by geography and ecological barriers, but also connected through occasional gene flow. Different populations evolved different modern traits first. Some developed modern facial structures earlier, others modern brain shapes, still others sophisticated tool technologies or symbolic behaviors. Through mixing and gene flow over hundreds of thousands of years, these innovations spread and combined. By around 200,000 years ago, populations across much of Africa had most or all modern human characteristics. But they weren't genetically or behaviorally uniform. Significant population structure persisted. Southern African populations remained somewhat distinct from East African ones. Central and West African populations had their own genetic signatures. These populations all count as Homo sapiens, but they showed considerable variation. Starting at least 200,000 years ago, some of these populations began expanding out of Africa into the Middle East. These early migrations sometimes failed, populations dying out or retreating, but they also sometimes resulted in long-term occupation of the Levant, with gene flow continuing between African and Middle Eastern populations. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, one or more populations succeeded in pushing beyond the Middle East into the rest of Eurasia. This expansion happened relatively quickly in geological terms, possibly driven by favorable climate conditions, technological innovations, or simply demographic pressures. These expanding populations carried a subset of African genetic diversity, which is why non-African populations have less variation than African ones. As modern humans spread across Eurasia, they encountered archaic human populations that had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years: Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Central and Eastern Asia, possibly other archaic species we haven't identified yet. These encounters resulted in interbreeding. Modern humans acquired genes from archaic populations, sometimes gaining useful adaptations, sometimes accumulating harmful variants. The mixed populations continued expanding. Some followed coastal routes through South Asia, reaching Australia by 65,000 years ago. Others pushed north into Central Asia and Siberia, eventually crossing into the Americas. Still, others moved into Europe, gradually replacing or absorbing Neanderthals. Meanwhile, back in Africa, populations continued evolving, mixing, adapting to local environments. Some populations in the Middle East, carrying both modern human and Neanderthal ancestry, migrated back into Africa, introducing Neanderthal genes to African populations. This back migration might have happened multiple times over tens of thousands of years. The result is that every human population alive today is a mixture. We all carry ancestry from multiple source populations, modern and archaic, African and Eurasian. The boundaries between populations have always been fuzzy, permeable. Human evolution has been characterized by mixing and gene flow, not isolated lineages evolving separately. This revised understanding changes how we think about several key issues. First, the timing. Modern human origins can't be pinned to a single date anymore. Do we count the first appearance of any modern features around 300,000 years ago? The first population with all modern characteristics, maybe 200,000 years ago? The main expansion out of Africa, 60 to 70,000 years ago? Second, the location. There's no single birthplace of humanity. The Jebel Irhoud discoveries prove that. Modern features evolved across Africa, not in one special region. Trying to identify the exact spot where humans originated is like trying to identify the exact spot where a language originated. It's a category error. Languages, like species, emerge from populations distributed across space and time. Third, the mechanism. Human evolution didn't happen through a single population replacing all others. It happened through a complex process involving multiple populations, partial isolation, gene flow, mixing with archaic humans, local adaptation. The metaphor of a family tree with clean branches separating species doesn't work. The metaphor of a braided stream with channels splitting and reuniting is more accurate. Fourth, the implications for diversity. Modern human genetic diversity isn't just the result of recent evolution after leaving Africa. It also reflects ancient population structure within Africa, admixture with different archaic populations in different regions, and local adaptations over tens of thousands of years. The variation we see between populations has deep roots. This matters for how we think about race and human difference. The old out-of-Africa model seemed to suggest that all humans were essentially the same because we all descended from a small recent African population. Racial categories were meaningless because we hadn't been separated long enough to become substantially different. The new picture is more nuanced. We're all closely related, yes. We all share recent African ancestry, yes. But we also carry ancestry from different archaic populations. We've been adapting to different environments for tens of thousands of years, and some genetic differences between populations are functionally significant. This doesn't validate racist ideologies. Genetic differences between populations are generally small compared to variation within populations. Most traits show overlap between groups. The idea of discrete races with clear boundaries is still scientifically invalid, but acknowledging that populations do differ genetically and that some differences have biological consequences is important for medicine, for understanding disease susceptibility, for personalized healthcare. The revised Out of Africa story also changes how we think about modern cognition. When did we become behaviorally modern? The old model suggested a sudden leap, maybe a genetic mutation around 70,000 years ago that gave us language or symbolic thought. The archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior before that time was sparse, fitting with the idea of a late cognitive revolution, but the new evidence suggests symbolic behavior has deeper roots. Shell beads and ochre use date back over 100,000 years in multiple regions. The Jebel Irhoud humans were making sophisticated tools 300,000 years ago. Maybe modern cognition evolved gradually, like modern anatomy, with different populations developing different capabilities that spread through cultural exchange and gene flow. Or maybe the archaeological record is just incomplete. Symbolic behaviors that use perishable materials wouldn't survive. We might be missing huge swaths of early human cultural development simply because the evidence didn't preserve. Either way, the simple story of sudden cognitive modernity around 70,000 years ago looks increasingly untenable. Modern human cognition, like modern human anatomy, probably emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. With contributions from multiple populations and regions, the role of admixture in human evolution is another area where understanding has shifted dramatically. The old model treated admixture as minimal or irrelevant. Modern humans replaced archaic ones without significant mixing. The new model recognizes that admixture was common and important. Genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans gave modern humans adaptations to new environments. They affected immunity, metabolism, altitude tolerance, cold adaptation. Some archaic genes are still under positive selection in modern populations, meaning they continue to provide advantages. Our success as a species was partly built on genetic borrowing from populations that had been adapting to Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. This creates an interesting philosophical question. If we acquired functionally important genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans, genes that remain beneficial today, are those species really extinct? Or did they get absorbed into modern human populations, their genetic legacy living on in us? It's a question of definition more than biology. But it matters for how we frame human evolutionary history. The current state of Out of Africa research is one of productive chaos. New discoveries are being made constantly. New technologies allow for analyses that weren't possible a decade ago. Ancient DNA is revealing population movements and mixing events we had no idea occurred. Fossil discoveries are pushing dates back and expanding the geographic scope of early human evolution. Within this chaos, certain things are becoming clearer. Africa was definitely the primary source of modern human ancestry. Modern features first appeared there. The genetic evidence is overwhelming, but the process was complex, involving multiple populations and regions over hundreds of thousands of years. Admixture with archaic humans was common and consequential. It shaped modern human genomes in important ways. We're not pure Homo Sapiens. We're mixtures carrying archaic ancestry that still affects us today. The boundaries between species and populations have always been fuzzy. Gene flow has been a constant throughout human evolution. Isolated lineages are the exception, not the rule. And finally, there's still enormous uncertainty about details. We don't know exactly how many populations contributed to modern humans. We don't know the full extent of admixture with archaic species. We don't know when specific traits evolved or which populations developed them first. We're missing huge amounts of fossil and archaeological data. This uncertainty isn't failure, it's the frontier. Every major discovery raises new questions. Every answer leads to deeper mysteries. That's what makes this field exciting. We're not refining a well-understood story. The out-of-Africa theory, properly understood, isn't a rigid doctrine. It's a framework for organizing evidence and generating hypotheses. As evidence changes, the framework adapts. What matters is that it remains grounded in data, tested against new discoveries, revised when necessary. So, what does out of Africa really mean now? It means modern humans originated primarily in Africa, through a complex process involving multiple populations across the continent over hundreds of thousands of years. It means these populations began expanding out of Africa repeatedly, with the final successful expansion occurring 60 to 70,000 years ago. It means extensive admixture with archaic humans both inside and outside Africa. It means continuous gene flow and mixing have characterized human evolution from the beginning. It's not as simple as the story we learned in school, but it's more accurate, more honest about uncertainty, more reflective of the actual complexity of evolution, and far more interesting than a simple tale of one population in one place at one time. The human origin story is still being written. Every year brings new chapters, new twists, new revelations. What we know today will be revised tomorrow. That's not a bug in the scientific process. It's a feature. Understanding evolves as evidence accumulates. And right now, the evidence is accumulating faster than ever before. So here we are. We've journeyed through 300,000 years of human evolution. We've watched the simple out-of-Africa story crumble under new evidence. We've seen fossils from Morocco that shouldn't exist, genetic data revealing ghost populations, evidence of extensive mixing with archaic humans, multiple migrations in multiple directions, and complexity that no textbook could have predicted. And you know what? We still don't really know where we came from. That probably sounds frustrating. After all this evidence, all these discoveries, all this sophisticated genetic analysis and fossil dating, we should have definitive answers, right? We should be able to point to a map and say, there, that's where humans originated. We should be able to give exact dates, name specific populations, draw clean family trees showing exactly how we became us. But we can't. And maybe we never will. Let me explain. When we ask where humans originated, we're implying there's a single answer, a birthplace, a moment of creation. Species don't pop into existence fully formed. They emerge gradually from ancestral populations through processes that are messy, complicated, and often impossible to pin down precisely. Think about languages. When did French become a distinct language from Latin? There's no exact date. Latin didn't suddenly transform into French one Tuesday afternoon. Instead, the Latins spoken in different regions gradually diverged over centuries. At some point, the differences became great enough that we call them separate languages. But the boundary is arbitrary, fuzzy, a matter of convention more than objective reality. Human evolution is similar. At what point did archaic humans become modern humans? When the first modern facial features appeared, when brain shape changed, when symbolic behavior emerged. Different traits evolved at different times in different populations. There's no single moment of transformation, no clean boundary between archaic and modern. The Jebel Irhoud humans illustrate this perfectly. They had modern faces but archaic brains. Are they Homo sapiens? It depends on how you define the species. You can make reasonable arguments either way. The ambiguity isn't a failure of scientific knowledge. It's a fundamental feature of how evolution works. This means that asking where humans originated might be like asking where French originated. You can point to a general region, a time period, a process, but trying to nail it down more precisely than that is fighting against the nature of gradual evolutionary change. And the evidence keeps revealing just how gradual and complex that change was. Every major discovery of the last decade has added complexity, not clarity. The Jebel Irhoud fossils showed modern features appearing earlier and in different places than expected. Genetic studies revealed multiple source populations within Africa. Ancient DNA demonstrated extensive admixture outside Africa. Each finding made the picture more complicated. Some researchers find this frustrating. Others find it exhilarating. Because what we're uncovering is the actual complexity of human evolution, not some simplified version textbooks can easily teach. We're seeing evolution in action, all its messy glory. Multiple populations, gene flow, admixture, local adaptation, complex demographic history. This is how evolution really works. But the complexity creates real challenges for science. How do you test hypotheses when the system has so many moving parts? How do you distinguish between different models when they all fit some aspects of the data? How do you avoid just making up stories that sound plausible but might be completely wrong? These are questions that paleoanthropologists grapple with constantly. The field has become increasingly sophisticated methodologically. Researchers use statistical models to test demographic scenarios. They run simulations to see which evolutionary histories best explain genetic data. They integrate evidence from multiple disciplines, fossils, archaeology, genetics, paleoclimate, to constrain possibilities. But there are limits. Some questions might simply be unanswerable with available evidence. We'll probably never know exactly how many populations contributed to modern humans. We'll probably never recover complete fossil sequences showing gradual evolution of every trait. We'll probably never resolve debates about exactly when and where specific innovations first appeared. And that's okay. Science isn't about achieving perfect knowledge. It's about progressively improving our understanding, acknowledging uncertainty honestly, and being willing to revise theories when new evidence appears. The current complexity in human origins research reflects honest engagement with difficult data, not failure to find simple answers. What we can say with confidence is this: modern humans emerged in Africa through a process involving multiple populations spread across the continent. This process began at least 300,000 years ago and continued for hundreds of thousands of years. Different populations evolved different modern traits, which spread through gene flow and mixing. By 200,000 years ago, populations with fully modern anatomy existed in multiple African regions. Starting at least 200,000 years ago, some populations began expanding out of Africa. Early expansions often failed, but maintained some gene flow between African and Middle Eastern populations. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a major expansion succeeded in permanently establishing modern humans across Eurasia. These expanding populations mixed with archaic humans, acquiring genes that remain in modern genomes. This story, while complex, represents genuine progress. We understand far more about human origins now than we did 20 years ago. New technologies continue to reveal information that was previously inaccessible. Ancient DNA, advanced dating methods, high-resolution climate reconstructions all contribute to a more detailed picture. Future discoveries will undoubtedly revise this picture further. There are entire regions that remain poorly explored. Central Africa, vast areas of Asia, places where fossils almost certainly exist but haven't been found yet. Each new fossil has the potential to change our understanding significantly. Technological advances might also help fill gaps. Improved ancient DNA extraction might allow recovery of genetic material from older African fossils. Better preservation detection methods might identify promising sites in tropical regions. Satellite imaging and machine learning might help locate fossil-bearing formations more efficiently. But some mysteries will likely remain unsolved. The ghost populations revealed by genetics might never be connected to physical fossils. The behavioral capabilities of early humans, their languages, social structures, thoughts, these leave minimal archaeological traces. The exact demographic processes that created modern humans, the population sizes, migration patterns, gene flow dynamics, we might never resolve these to full satisfaction. And that's the beautiful frustration of studying human origins. It's a mystery that keeps revealing new layers. We're detectives investigating a case where most evidence has been destroyed, Witnesses are long dead, and new clues keep appearing in unexpected places. But it's our case, our origin story, the mystery of where we came from, how we became human, what makes us us. It's the most personal scientific question imaginable. We're studying ourselves, our own evolution, trying to understand the deep history that shaped our species. Some people find the uncertainty uncomfortable. They want clear answers, definitive statements, textbook simplicity. The idea that science doesn't fully understand human origins, that major debates remain unresolved, that we might never have complete answers, it's unsettling, but I find it profound. We're a species capable of contemplating our own origins, of using science to peer back hundreds of thousands of years, of reconstructing events that happened before language, before writing, before civilization. We've learned an extraordinary amount through patient, systematic research. The fact that mysteries remain just shows how deep the rabbit hole goes. Every human alive today carries the legacy of this complex history. In our genes, we carry ancestry from multiple African populations, from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, possibly from other archaic species we haven't identified. We're walking libraries of human evolutionary history, if we can learn to read the record properly. In our anatomy, we carry features that evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago in populations spread across Africa. The shape of your skull, the structure of your face, the proportions of your body, all reflect ancient adaptations to African environments. In our behavior, we carry patterns that developed over millions of years of human evolution. Our capacity for language, our social complexity, our tool use, our symbolic thought, these didn't emerge suddenly. They built gradually through countless generations of humans and pre-humans adapting to their worlds. Understanding this history changes how we think about ourselves. We're not the pinnacle of evolution. We're participants in an ongoing process. We're not separate from nature. We're products of natural selection like every other species. We're not pure or special. We're mixtures, hybrids, carrying genetic legacy from multiple sources. But we're also remarkable. We're the species that figured this out, that learned to read our own origin story in bones and genes and stone tools, that developed the methods and technologies to peer into deep time, that cares enough about where we came from to dedicate careers to finding answers. The Out of Africa debate, in all its current complexity, represents science at its best. Researchers from multiple disciplines, multiple countries, multiple theoretical perspectives, all working to understand the same phenomenon. They disagree about details, argue about interpretations, propose competing models. This is how knowledge advances, not through proclamations from authority, but through careful observation, rigorous testing, honest acknowledgement of uncertainty. The simple Out of Africa story served us well for decades. It organized evidence, generated predictions, guided research. But as evidence accumulated, the story had to change. That's not failure. That's science working properly. So where did Homo sapiens evolve? In Africa, through a complex process involving multiple populations across hundreds of thousands of years. When did we leave Africa? Repeatedly. Over at least 200,000 years, with the major expansion succeeding around 60 to 70,000 years ago. Did we mix with other humans? Extensively, both inside and outside Africa. Are we pure Homo sapiens? No. We're mixtures carrying archaic ancestry that still affects us. These answers are more complex than the simple story. They're harder to summarize, harder to teach, harder to fit into neat narratives. More honest about what we know and what we don't, more reflective of evolution's actual complexity. And the mystery continues. Right now, somewhere, a researcher is examining a newly discovered fossil, or analyzing ancient DNA, or excavating a promising site, or running simulations of demographic history. Each of these efforts might reveal something that changes our understanding. That's the excitement of studying human origins. The story isn't finished. We're still writing it. So the next time you hear someone confidently state exactly where humans originated, exactly when we evolved, exactly how it happened, be skeptical. The truth is more nuanced, more uncertain, more fascinating than any simple answer could capture. We know a lot. We've learned an enormous amount through decades of painstaking research, but we're also aware of how much we don't know, how much we might never know, how much remains mysterious despite all our sophisticated methods and technologies. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the origin of our species, the emergence of the creatures capable of asking these questions, should remain partially mysterious. Maybe some things are too complex, too deep in time, too thoroughly erased by geological processes to ever fully understand. Or maybe not. Maybe tomorrow someone will find the fossil that answers everything. Maybe new technologies will unlock secrets we thought forever lost. Maybe the next generation of researchers will solve puzzles that seem intractable today. That's the thing about mysteries. They stay mysterious until suddenly they don't. And in the meantime, we keep searching, keep questioning, keep piecing together fragments of evidence into increasingly sophisticated stories about where we came from. Because ultimately, understanding our origins matters. It tells us who we are, where we fit in nature, how we relate to other humans and other species. It shapes how we think about human diversity, about evolution, about our place in the universe. So the Out of Africa story continues to evolve. Africa remains central to our origin story, but the details are complex, involving multiple populations, multiple migrations, extensive mixing, and demographic processes we're still working to understand. We didn't evolve in one place at one time. We emerged gradually, across a continent, through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And we're still emerging, still changing, still carrying forward the legacy of those ancient populations who somehow, against tremendous odds, became us. That's where we came from. That's the mystery. And that's the best answer science can currently provide. Not simple, not certain, but honest about the evidence and the enormous complexity it reveals. Still being written, still full of surprises, still fundamentally mysterious despite everything we've learned. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. Somewhere in the remote highlands of Ethiopia, or deep in the Congo rainforest, or buried beneath the Sahara Desert, there's a fossil waiting. A skull, maybe, or a complete skeleton if we're extraordinarily lucky. This fossil is 350,000 years old, and when someone finally finds it, decades from now, or maybe next week, it will answer questions we didn't even know to ask. That's the thing about studying human origins. The story keeps changing not because scientists can't make up their minds, but because new evidence keeps appearing, and the pace of discovery is accelerating. Think about what we've learned just in the last 20 years. In 2004, we discovered Homo floresiensis, the hobbit people of Indonesia, an entire human species we had no idea existed. In 2010, we sequenced the first Neanderthal genome and discovered we'd been interbreeding with them. In 2015, Homo naledi was found in South Africa, challenging our understanding of which human species were alive when. In 2017, the Jebel Irhoud fossils pushed our origins back 100,000 years. Each of these discoveries required revising textbooks, rethinking theories, acknowledging that what we thought we knew was incomplete. If anything, the rate of major discoveries is increasing as technology improves and more researchers join the search. Ancient DNA technology, in particular, is revolutionizing the field. Today, we can sequence entire genomes from bone fragments tens of thousands of years old. We can identify species, trace migrations, detect admixture, reconstruct population sizes, all from genetic material that survived against impossible odds. The technology keeps improving. Methods that required large bone samples now work with tiny fragments. Techniques that only worked in cold, dry environments are being adapted for tropical fossils. Researchers are developing ways to extract DNA from sediments, potentially revealing human presence at sites where no bones survived. Each advance opens new possibilities. Within the next decade, we'll probably have ancient DNA from dozens of early human fossils, not just from Europe and Asia, where preservation is good, but potentially from Africa itself. If researchers can extract genetic material from 50,000-year-old African fossils, or 70,000, or even 100,000, it would transform our understanding of human population, structure, and evolution. Imagine sequencing DNA from the Jebel Irhoud skulls. we'd finally know how those 300,000-year-old North Africans relate genetically to other early humans. Were they direct ancestors of modern populations? A sister lineage that contributed genes but eventually disappeared? Part of a larger population spanning North Africa and the Middle East? The genetics would tell us. Or imagine recovering DNA from South African fossils dating to 200,000 years ago. We could directly observe the genetic diversity that existed then. Compare it to modern populations, trace how specific variants spread or disappeared. We could test demographic models with real ancient data instead of inferring everything from modern genomes. The technical challenges are enormous. DNA degrades rapidly in warm, humid conditions. African fossils have been exposed to exactly the conditions that destroy genetic material most quickly. But researchers are creative. They're trying new preservation methods, new extraction techniques, new ways to work with degraded DNA. It's not impossible, it's just very, very difficult. And if ancient DNA from Africa remains elusive, other technologies are filling gaps. Proteomics, the study of ancient proteins, works on older fossils than DNA analysis. Proteins are more stable molecules. They can survive hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would destroy DNA completely. Researchers have already used protein analysis to identify species, relationships, and the methods keep improving. Isotope analysis reveals where ancient humans lived and what they ate. Different environments have different isotopic signatures. These signatures get incorporated into bones and teeth as individuals grow. By analyzing isotopes, researchers can reconstruct movement patterns, dietary changes, environmental conditions. High-resolution CT scanning allows researchers to study fossil interiors without damaging them. Brain case volumes, inner ear structure, dental development, all can be examined non-destructively. This preserves precious fossils while extracting maximum information. And the scanning technology keeps getting better, revealing details that were invisible just a few years ago. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are being applied to fossil analysis. Algorithms can identify patterns in skull shape, predict missing portions of fragmentary fossils, search satellite imagery for promising fossil-bearing formations. These tools are still developing, but they're already helping researchers work more efficiently. Archaeological methods are advancing too. Improved excavation techniques recover artifacts that would have been missed decades ago. Better preservation methods protect fragile materials. More sophisticated analysis of stone tools, organic residues, ancient environments, all contribute to understanding how early humans lived, and the search is expanding geographically. More researchers from African institutions are leading projects, bringing local knowledge and perspectives. International collaborations are forming, pooling expertise and resources to tackle questions no single team could answer alone. Central Africa is particularly promising. The Congo Basin and surrounding regions have been understudied due to difficult access and political instability. But these forests were certainly inhabited by early humans. They might have harbored distinct populations that contributed to modern ancestry. Any fossils from this region would be tremendously valuable. The Arabian Peninsula is another frontier. During Ice Age low sea levels, it was a green corridor between Africa and Asia. Humans almost certainly passed through repeatedly. Recent discoveries show it was inhabited far earlier than previously thought. More systematic exploration could reveal crucial evidence about early migrations out of Africa. Southeast Asia holds mysteries too. Island environments that required water crossings. Multiple archaic human species living in proximity. Possible contact between different groups. The fossil record is sparse, but what exists suggests complex demographic history. More research could reveal surprising connections between populations. Even well-studied regions like Europe continue producing major discoveries. New caves are found, old collections are reanalyzed with modern methods. Fossils that sat in museum drawers for decades turn out to be from unknown species. There's still enormous potential in places we thought we knew well. The theoretical frameworks are evolving alongside the data. Population genetics models are becoming more sophisticated, incorporating complex demographic scenarios that would have been computationally impossible to test years ago. Researchers can now model multiple populations with varying connectivity, add mixture from multiple sources, changing population sizes, all simultaneously. These models make testable predictions. They say if human history unfolded in certain ways, we should see specific patterns in genetic data. Then researchers check whether those patterns actually exist. When models fail, they're revised. When they succeed, our confidence in the scenario increases. It's a rigorous approach to testing hypotheses about events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. Fossil discoveries and genetic studies are converging. Ancient DNA gives us direct glimpses of past populations. Fossils give us physical evidence of what those populations looked like. Together, they're painting increasingly detailed pictures of human evolutionary history. But perhaps the most important development is conceptual. Researchers are moving away from simple, linear narratives toward appreciation of complexity. Human evolution involved multiple populations, extensive gene flow, admixture, local adaptation, complex demography. The field is embracing this complexity rather than trying to force it into neat stories. This represents maturity in the discipline. Early paleoanthropology looked for simple answers. Who were our ancestors? Where did we come from? When did we evolve? These questions assumed clear answers existed. Now we recognize that evolution doesn't produce clear answers. It produces messy, complicated histories that require sophisticated methods to untangle. The questions are changing too. Instead of asking where humans originated, researchers ask about population, structure, gene flow dynamics, selective pressures in different environments. Instead of looking for the moment we became human, they examine gradual accumulation of modern traits across multiple populations. The questions acknowledge evolutionary complexity. This shift makes the science harder. Complex questions require complex methods, multidisciplinary collaborations, large data sets, sophisticated statistical analyses. The days of lone scientists finding fossils and pronouncing new species are mostly over. Modern paleoanthropology is collaborative, technical, and increasingly data-intensive. But it's also more robust. When multiple independent methods point to the same conclusions, confidence increases. When different research teams using different approaches reach similar findings, we know we're onto something real. The complexity is challenging, but it's also providing stronger, more reliable understanding. For people interested in human origins, this is a golden age. The combination of new fossil discoveries, ancient DNA breakthroughs, improved dating methods, and sophisticated analytical tools means we're learning more faster than ever before. The next decade will almost certainly bring revelations that rewrite major portions of the human story. Some of these revelations will come from expected places. Teams systematically excavating known fossil sites will find new specimens. Genetic studies will refine our understanding of population relationships. Archaeological research will reveal more about early human behavior and cognition. But the biggest surprises will come from unexpected discoveries. A fossil in a region no one was looking, a new dating method that changes timelines, a genetic signature revealing an unknown population. These are the findings that transform fields, the ones that force complete reconceptualization of human origins. And they're coming. Right now, somewhere, the evidence exists, buried in sediment, locked in bone, waiting for the right person with the right tools at the right time. The mystery of human origins isn't solved. It's barely begun. What we know today represents a fraction of what there is to know. The fossils we've found are a tiny sample of humans who lived. The DNA we've sequenced comes from an infinitesimal portion of ancient populations. The archaeological sites we've excavated are scattered across time and space, leaving enormous gaps. But each gap is an opportunity. Each unknown is a question waiting for an answer. Each mystery is a puzzle someone will eventually solve. The incompleteness of current knowledge isn't depressing. It's exciting. It means there's still so much to discover. Future researchers will look back at our current understanding, the way we look back at theories from 50 years ago. They'll see what we got right and what we got wrong. They'll have data we can only dream about. Technologies we haven't imagined. Methods that seem like magic from our perspective. And they'll solve mysteries that seem intractable today. But they'll also face new mysteries. Because every answer generates new questions. Every discovery reveals deeper complexity. Science is an endless process of learning more, while simultaneously discovering how much we don't know. Human origins research will never be finished. There will always be more to learn. For now, we work with what we have. We acknowledge that the simple Out of Africa story was too simple. We recognize that human origins involved complex processes across the African continent and beyond. We accept that admixture, gene flow, and population structure were fundamental to our evolution. We're honest about uncertainty and gaps in knowledge. And we keep looking, keep excavating, keep analyzing, keep testing hypotheses, keep pushing the boundaries of what's knowable. Because understanding where we came from matters. It shapes how we understand ourselves, our diversity, our place in nature, our future. The human origin story is still being written. Every fossil found, every genome sequenced, every site excavated adds new sentences, new paragraphs, sometimes new chapters. The story keeps getting richer, more detailed, more accurate, even as it gets more complex. This is the future of our past. More discoveries, better methods, deeper understanding, continued revision as evidence accumulates, honest acknowledgement of what we know and what we don't, excitement about mysteries waiting to be solved, and the profound recognition that studying where we came from is one of the most fundamentally human endeavors we can undertake. So the next time you see a news story about human origins, about a new fossil discovery or genetic breakthrough, remember it's part of an ongoing process. Not the final answer, not the complete truth, just another piece of an enormous puzzle. Another clue in humanity's longest-running mystery. Another step toward understanding ourselves. The journey continues. The mystery deepens. And somewhere, right now, the next major discovery is waiting to be found. Sleep well knowing that the story of where you came from is still being revealed, still surprising researchers, still holding secrets that will transform our understanding of what it means to be human. The mystery remains, and that's beautiful.